I'm so excited to be here with one of my favorite people. This is actually my son, John Linford, but I've not invited him just because he's my son. He actually is someone who understands one of our core concepts very well. And so I invited him to share some of his experiences and insights that he's gained about this principle of having touchstone or core media at the center. When we talk about digital centeredness, that's one of the places that we start. And here's the question that we pose to people in our first discussion called Start with Your Center. What are some touchstone or core media that have helped shaped me? This is the question we ask ourselves, that have shaped me and helped me feel and keep a sense of core purpose. So, John, first of all, if you could share some of your thoughts about and what you've learned both in your training and also in your experience, why does it matter to have touchstone or core media as a starting point as we are engaging in a complex and digitally driven world?
A great question. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity. It is a pleasure personally to be here, of course, but this is one of my absolute favorite topics just because, and this is a theme that I'll draw on multiple times, this is a principle that I feel from start to finish is so present and so necessary. So as a little bit of background of my training, as you alluded to, I went to Carl's G. Mazur Preparatory Academy, a very long name for an awesome school. It's a public charter school in Utah. And it was based off a Socratic classical method of education. And so as part of that, we just read a lot of classics. And we, from a very young age, starting in 7th grade, we were exposed to a lot of different principles, a lot of different stories that have been around in human civilization for millennia in a lot of cases. And a couple ideas about touchstones immediately come to mind, just drawing from these classics and from the training that we received of thinking deeply and interacting through discussion. One of the first is the archetype of the hero's journey. It's something that's so classic that some people say, Homer kind of invented it, but in all reality, it's been around as long as humans have been around, right? That you have a hero that experiences trial or trauma, they overcome it to reach point B, whatever their destination ends up being. What is consistent across all those stories is there's always an opposition of some kind. And in response, there's some sort of inner strength or inner draw that is built upon to overcome it. So my favorite example is probably Odysseus. So in the Odyssey, he goes off to Troy, he fights this massive battle, he has to fight through a ton of stuff, all of his friends die, or most of his friends, and then he has to end up trying to make it back to Ithaca to see his wife. Now his wife's being awesome, she's holding down the fort back home, and she's being courted by all these guys who are eating all of her food and all this stuff. Crazy things are happening, and not only does he have to cross an entire ocean to get back home, but he has to run into monsters and witches and God sent storms, all these different things. And his touchstone, using that word, what he continues to come back to is the integrity he has to his wife, the love that he has for his country, and the responsibility that he feels as the man of the house, as the provider, as the one who keeps everything together, as the rock of his household. His touchstone is something that, regardless of the external circumstances, is something that he's able to continue with. And again, we just see this repeated consistently and constantly. You go to Dante and you go to his experiences in the Inferno, right? He's literally being led through by Virgil, about the Aeneid. And what are some of his touchstones? Well, it's a lot of the Christian ideals. And of course, being in Judeo-Christian society, these are things that we should pay attention to, if only because they've been iterative. They've been repeated across almost every civilization in some form, that thou shalt nots and thou shalts. And he finds that throughout all of it, he makes it all the way through the Inferno, makes it up into purgatory, and makes it on past that as well, by focusing on the good or the right. The Greeks talk about this a lot. And these are all things that we talked about and learned about as part of our classical education. It became practical as in my junior and senior year. I actually helped create a class, you can do that in a public charter school, with a few of my friends, called Directed Readings, where we essentially read classical literature about education and had discussions and created essays and some sort of deliverable from that about how to create good education. And what we just kept coming back to is you have to have some sort of touchstone, some sort of thing that you can come back to. You can bring other ideals and ideas and compare them. And I think that bears fruit in a lot of different ways. In an education model specifically, especially as you're being raised in a place where, as you know, in your work, there's a lot of different voices, especially in a digital world. There's so many different things coming at you, so many different voices, especially at a young age. It's extremely overwhelming. And so to be able to give a child or a young student a litany of books, you say, hey, these are all really great books. They've withstood the test of time. That was one of the first things we discussed, is what makes a classic a classic. And one of them is just longevity. The fact that the Aeneid and the Odyssey, actually I'll use Homer as an example because it's one of the best ones. Of the ancient texts, we essentially have one copy. You know, the Bible, just to juxtapose that, we have about 5,000 ancient copies of the Bible, but we have one of Homer. And yet it's been wildly successful and has continued throughout every age of time, which to me and to us in this class really speaks to, okay, there's something about this book that's pulling at something human within us that is constant across time. That's something that we can trust. As a touchstone, I think the first thing is consistency. That's a consistent message that you can constantly draw upon and apply in different situations. I think the next one, the second one, is that it clearly delineates good and evil. One of the things that we talked about frequently was how much evil to introduce into a book. The classic example is Brave New World. It's a dystopian novel which essentially creates a flipped moral society than the one that we currently experience. Well, maybe not anymore, but it's one that, you know, gratuitous sex, drug, alcohol use and a lifestyle is the normal. And the main character who objects to that, of maybe having one sexual partner, is looked down upon and actually chastened. What are you doing? This isn't our society. And the argument is, well, do we really want high schoolers reading this book because it exemplifies this sort of lifestyle? But throughout the book, it's very clear that he's fighting against something that's wrong. It's identified in the book, and as well with the right mentor. And this is something we talked about as well. You have to have mentors with these touchstones. A lot of ideas. But you have to have both in order to know, once again, the opposition and the good, using the way the Greeks did, like good, this higher good, this eudaimonia, this good living, and together they can come together. Once you have a touchstone, once you have something that's consistent and can delineate at least some choices, it makes the other smaller choices a little bit easier. So for me personally, some of my core books are some of the ones that I've mentioned. So a lot of the classics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid are some of my favorites. I love the Inferno. I love Paradise Lost. These are books that have withstood the test of time, so that when, for instance, I come across Ender's Game, another one of my favorite books, or Speaker for the Dead, the second in that series, it's a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complicated story, a lot of psychology, a lot of pretty difficult choices objectively that don't have super clear answers. And yeah, I'm able to go back to the basics, go back to my classics, go back to my touchstone and say, what resonates here? Ender's Game only came out, a decade ago, maybe a little bit over 15 years, perhaps. And yeah, I can match it up against classics and be able to derive those principles of continuity pretty well and find some sort of consistency, even if it hasn't lasted for very long. So kind of at a high level, it's a lot of thoughts, but a touchstone, I feel, is not only useful, but crucial. Because otherwise, if you don't have a touchstone, if you don't have something to return to, you're wishy-washy. Every new book and every new fad and every new political agenda just becomes the new thing, and it becomes just as good as the rest. So without some sort of more objective, I don't know if it's possibly completely, but more objective standard, you're able to sift and delineate between good, better, and best choices as you interact with a very complicated world.
Part of the reason I wanted you to talk about it is, as your mother, watching the power of that in the education that you got that was different from what I received has really converted me to leaning on classical literature more, but it's not often folded in this specific kind of way. If a parent was interested in this, or if a peer was interested, or if a teacher was interested in the process of using classical literature or other Touchstone-like media, what advice would you give them?
That's another really good question. So back to that class, that was actually one of our assignments basically throughout the course of the semester, was we were to find a touchstone, where we actually started with a list of what are deemed as classical literature. Of course, there's all sorts of opinions.
There are debates about that, sure.
Debates about that, but there's a good, I'd say 100 to 150 books that are very consistently labeled as classical by, I'd say, a majority of people. And I would also argue that history has kind of judged a lot of them as being classical, that something in them, even if it's not necessarily, what's the word I'm looking for? If they're not tangible, if there's not something tangible that you can draw away from that, oh, this is what made this book classical, something about it has spoken to people over millennia.
And across cultures. It's been translated different languages.
Absolutely, right? I think the Bible is a great example, right? Going back to that, where we have 5,000 ancient copies of the Bible that has been translated into hundreds of languages and been reprinted and read more than any other book. Regardless of your religious standpoint, the Bible, the way I'll usually talk about it is the Bible is true, in that truth is just something that resonates deep within humanity, right? Les Mis is a true book. It speaks.
That's one of the ones that comes to mind for me. Yeah. Exactly,
right? And Les Mis is a very common one. For me, yeah, it's a lot of the classical ones. I think Paradise Lost really impacted me. But why? Honestly, I don't know. I don't know fully what tangible thing. And so that's hard to deliver to someone else. Like, here, have this thing. I think my recommendation would be, first of all, you just have to engage in it. And I guess the sub point zero for that is, if you want to engage in it, you have to want to, and you have to see why. And so my first recommendation for a teacher or a peer, someone, is, hey, let me talk to you about what it has meant in my life to have something that I can consistently return back to. Because I'm growing up in an age where I have 4 different social media platforms. I have literally dozens of communication methods at my disposal that I use on a regular basis. I was counting it up the other day. I think I have, on a regular day, I will use 9 or 10 different communication platforms.
Wow.
Crazy, right? And probably more if you include the ones that just kind of come passive communication, where I'm receiving news or headlines or other things through email updates, whatever it is. I'm inundated with information.
This is the attention economy. It's just everywhere.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's our time is literally money, and our attention is money. And so the first thing I would recommend to anyone is find someone who seems like they're passionate about this and ask them why. Because the first and easiest way, as it works anciently, right, is through just simple communication between 2 people. That's what this conversation is, and the conversations that you create in your work.
And a mentor like Plato and Socrates.
Exactly, right?
Yes.
And that's what happened with me. So 2 of my teachers, 2 of my mentors at Mazer, they helped inspire that. I'd always been a reader. I enjoyed getting lost in, especially fantasy worlds, but it wasn't until about high school.
Thank you, J.K. Rowling.
Yeah, right? Harry Potter changed my life. But it wasn't until high school I really started to shift what I not just read, like you said, right, just because you have to read it for class, but actually dug my teeth into and said, what is it about this book that is so impactful? Like, this is so exciting. And that came from watching these teachers read and then talk about what they were reading in a way that I had never heard talked about before. And so my first recommendation, if people want to know about this, talk to someone who's passionate about it. Talk to me, talk to another big reader that you know, and say, what is it about these books? What is it about this literature, whatever form, that makes your soul tingle, right?
Or like going to watch Les Mis. There is the classic put in another form. Yeah, it's perpetuating itself in another art form. What is it that is drawing people to these stories?
My second recommendation is one that honestly is it's the hardest part about this whole thing, is be willing to put in the work. It is so easy to have an opinion in our day and age. It's so easy to find someone else's opinion and parrot it. But to have genuine opinions about literally anything the example that comes to mind most often is politics, but to have an opinion in the way that you interact in a intimate friendship, right? Something that you have a lot of trust, you have a lot of good communication. How do you treat a person in that situation? What is and isn't okay? You can find, so I'm a researcher in a lot of different settings. I did debate in high school. I've done data. I'm currently studying data science and statistics. I've worked as a research assistant. Like, that is part of my niche. Is I love collecting a ton of information. I'm always suspicious when people have an absolute definitive, like, no, I read this study about this, and that's why this is true. It's like, okay, that's great. I can find 5 or 6 studies right now that will directly contradict it and will have just as good statistics to back it up, right? So what do, right? And so you have to go back to basics. You have to go back to true principles, because without those, you really are lost. But it takes work. It takes a lot of effort to actually have substantive opinions about anything. And by definition, that's hard. And so, yes, you gotta talk to someone who's really passionate about it, and you get really hyped and you say, cool, I'm gonna go find a touchstone. It's like, well, that probably means you're gonna need to read upwards of a dozen books just to start.
At least just to start.
If for no other reason than to see what speaks to you.
Right.
Because that's the definition of a touchstone, is not only something that speaks to everyone, but it has to be in a language that's accessible to you. I can think of several examples of books that we've both read, where we've kind of selected different paths. I'm thinking right now of C. Terry Warner versus Brene Brown, are 2 authors that we've talked about, where Brene Brown is like, I enjoy her material. I think she has cool ideas, but her language just doesn't speak to me as much. Whereas C. Terry Warner talks about a lot of really similar topics, but I just get him. Right?
We find the language that we can understand. Yes.
But you take a step back and you say, okay, what are Brene Brown and C. Terry Warner talking about? Well, they're talking about how to interact with human beings in right relationship, right? The first thing I'm thinking of the Iliad. I'm thinking of how, that's what I think of, right? I'm thinking of how Achilles interacts with all of his different counterparts in the war as the man, as the masculine, mostest, bestest, all the superlatives. How does he interact with people who are subordinate to him, right? How does Penelope interact with her suitors, her supposed enemies, while still following her cultural mandates for hospitality, right? There's so many complicated relationship things in there that start translating over. Then you get into, later into Paradise Lost, you go later into Les Mis, you get more recently into, one of mine, Ender's Game. These are all talking about human relationships. And then we finally arrive at a C. Terry Warner or a Brene Brown or Jordan Peterson, where they're talking about principles of human interaction. It's not coming from nowhere. It's following a very similar, almost identical human interaction archetype that always existed. And so it's just not something you can dismiss. You can't just dismiss it out of hand.
Can I interject something in there that, and you can tell me if you agree with this, but as you bring up a C. Terry Warner or a Brene Brown, before even talking about relationships with others, they're talking about integrity within yourself. That in order to have relationships that are in integrity with others, you have to know what your core is and live true to it. It's fun to see how it's really reinforcing that notion that we have to know what our center is, and to keep reinforcing and rediscovering, like we've been doing with our little shared book club, of reading more modern books and saying, okay, how do they match with our core touchstone principles and the literature that kind of has grounded us? What do we take? That allows us to build this media literacy skill, to keep trying on different voices. And for me anyway, it helps me feel like the language of my touchstone expands, and I feel like I'm able to understand other people and perhaps how they might talk about their values and their center, even if they're religious perspective or even philosophical. We can find ways to communicate with others if we each are centered, if we each know where our grounding is. Thoughts on that?
You're tapping into something non-unique, right?
Yes.
You're tapping into something that exists in humanity at large. Again, evidenced by the consistent literature and the consistent stories that even if it's not the same religion or the same culture, right? The Tao Te Ching is talking about almost the exact same principles as the Bhagavad Gita, which is talking about almost the exact as the Bible, right? It's there, when you get down to the fundamental principles, the ideas of how to act as a right human being in right relationship, nigh on identical. There's different cultural examples, they apply it in different ways, but the base, you could say like the base code. I spent a lot of time doing data analysis and programming. The base code for all of these is the exact same. And from that, you have a C++, and you have a SAS, and you have an R, and you have a Python.
I like that metaphor.
And they're used for different things. And I think that's something that's really important to recognize with the idea of diversity, that as you're ingesting all these different, I use that verbiage deliberately, right? Where you're ingesting, you're drinking from the Pierian spring is the classic. Do not drink lightly. I don't know what the translation is, but do not drink lightly from that Pierian spring. The idea being, if you're just sampling the ideas that have come from the result of all this background, you're missing out on the conversation. You're hearing the gossip essentially of deeper and deeper and deeper principles that you can track back not only through history but also within yourself. That as you're taking the steps back into history and you're following the classical ladder all the way back to its beginnings, you're really, like to your point of being centered with yourself, you're tracking back farther and farther into your own understanding of humanity and of reality. Once you've done that, then you can really start to make effective steps forward. What I find so often is I'll be talking about some hot button topic politically, and I'll say something that is certainly not intended as offensive. It's like, well, what do you think about this? Like, what do you think about this principle that kind of contradicts what you're saying? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And the immediate reaction is, whoa, like, how dare you, right? Because I'm treading on sacred ground. I'm interrupting something that's very personal and very emotional to them. But is it really? Because what I'm really treading on is something that they've based their entire being on. Is they're using this gossip, this opinion that they're spouting from someone else. And I mean, no one wants to look the fool, right? And so they'll defend it. They'll defend it with everything they have. It's like, no, but this has to be correct. But according to these true principles that I've found from taking the steps back, is it? Not even necessarily it is or isn't.
We all have to ask that too, because we all have our blind spots and our hot buttons. And
I guess what I'm really trying to get at is, I find that if you really do believe in what you're saying, you have to justify less. One of my personal rules in this Touchstone sphere is, if I have to justify it, I'm already wrong. Not explain it. There's a difference where I'll explain my position, like, no, here, this is what I'm thinking, and here's why. I'm open to other alternatives, to other opinions. But justify meaning I will live and die on this thing, whatever it is, because usually it's never a principle, right? It's never a principle that you're putting out here. You're like, I must believe in this thing, right? More often than not, it's
a policy or a position or a, yeah.
Exactly, right? It's something that is in a lot of ways superfluous.
It's a branch.
It's a branch. It's not the root. And when I have to justify one of those, okay, something's not right within myself. Again, coming back here to my personal center, I'm not feeling good about whatever it is I'm defending. Again, this is kind of going to more like the practical application, right? I have to draw back in and say, okay, where am I actually on this topic and why? And more often than not, I'll come out of it and say, you know what? I know why I wasn't feeling great about this and why I was feeling so attacked is because I didn't actually believe in what I was saying in the first place. Based on true principles, things that I found to be true, I'm going to take a couple steps and arrive back at this principle. I think this is something that I can get more behind. What do you think about this? And I always find that's a more productive conversation. And if I can engage other people in that, even in the middle of the conversation, just by asking questions, just by listening, So I said, yeah, why do you think that? Like, where do you think that comes from? And they'll say, well, I was raised this way in this sort of a community. And so this is probably why I have this opinion. Like, okay, yeah, why do you think that became important to you? Like, why did you take that in? Well, that's a good question. Then we'll be able to have a much more productive conversation that we're almost, we're two people talking about this one policy. We're almost like retracting back
into our own process, right?
And then returning back.
That's a kind of civic engagement I can get my head around. Yeah.
And you can engage that without doing necessarily the legwork to go back and read all the classical literature and figure out what your actual touchstone is and do all the comparative research. You can do that just in conversation, just by listening. But again, that is a true principle. That is something that the classics teach. I keep going back to Iliad and the Odyssey. That's like, I guess, the theme for tonight. But I'm thinking about the interaction between Circe and Odysseus, where she's like basically seducing him. She's like, yo, you're super attractive. You should stay here on this island. You're cool. I want to keep you. Like, you obviously like it here. And he's like, honestly, yeah, I do like it here. This is a really cool spot. And has a very frank conversation. And it's something that's always blown my mind a little bit, because Odysseus, he basically says to Circe, like, you're literally a goddess. Like, my wife, like, in a lot of ways can't compare because she's mortal, right? By every like objective standard, like, absolutely, this is the place to be. It's a very nuanced conversation, right? Where it's like, yeah, there's this, and you can apply this in a lot of ways. There's this thing out there that I should be achieving and should be doing, but it's not true to me. And so it doesn't matter. And I think that the phrase is literally like, my wife cannot compare in the least in beauty or grace or all these different things, but she's mine. She's my wife. And
I've committed there.
My country. Yeah. I'm going to go back and I'm leaving. And she, of course, gets all up in arms and tries to kill him and everyone else, which shows how healthy the relationship was in the beginning. But not following true principle. Again, you see where following true principles gets you. But it's those sorts of conversations where there's this glimmering ideal that's out there. And if you give into that, you're giving into something that is inherently dangerous. And we see this in our conversation generally, not even political, just our conversation generally in our society today. But we don't listen. We don't take time to ask questions, to go back to touch points, and to allow each other to go all the way back. Because it's a decent journey to legitimately say, okay, why do I believe? Oh, see, I told you didn't believe in what you're saying. This is why my opinion is correct, right? You get a ball in their face about it. But giving them the space to actually go back to a touchstone. So for Odysseus to take a step back, look back at his country and say, you know what? I'm with her.
That's who I am.
That's my country. That's who I am back there. Let me come back to this conversation with truth. And I can interact and make concrete, deliberate decisions based on principle. And I'm going to get on my boat and get out of here. Like, that is a principle that should be true today and can come as we're willing to let each other engage in these conversations, to return back to our touchstones, wherever they are, allow each other that space, whether that's the space to like take years to form opinions and read books and do all the things and the work, to actually come back and engage in productive, meaningful conversation that can actually move us forward.
The goal is no longer about a debate at all. It's about going back. This, again, was not planned. Our model goes, the very last thing we talk about is digital citizenship and media literacy, starting with your center so you can engage. But I hadn't anticipated our conversation to go there. What I'm hearing you say is, as we engage in citizenship, if we really do practice listening, not in a cursory way to check it off a box to say I'm being a good citizen, but actually holding enough space for someone to be able to reflect, self-reflect, and find voice for their looking back home, looking into their home. I'm doing the Odysseus thing, and then just kind of sitting in that co-humanity of our journeys, our own heroes' journeys that we have to sort out, and holding space for that. So that I'm really, really grateful that emerged. I have one more question for you. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah.
I'm actually going to insert one thought before the question. As I listened to you, I think of one of the books that we did share, one of the more modern books. It's a nonfiction, Lead Yourself First. It talks about the definition of solitude, being able to be in your own mind, be in your own self without other voices. So we may read, we may engage, we may listen, we may study, but truly coming back and deciding, okay, but who am I? And owning that separate from any other voices. So I just wanted, it was fun. I really appreciated that language around this process. I think it relates to the Touchstone process, that solitude is finding your own truth, your own center, your own grounding, your own principles, your own compass, whatever that language is. Okay, the last question I have is, in a digital world where there are so many voices, you talk about all the tools you have, and how the corollary to that is how easy it is to be distracted, to be at the roots all the time, to be parroting other voices rather than finding our own, or rediscovering and feeding that process of staying centered. What advice do you have for your peers and, the generation just behind you? How do you make time for that? What advice would you give them in terms of managing digital tools and prioritizing centering activities?
Another really good question. My advice is very practical and very simple. The social platforms I participate in are primarily Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. During the week, during my work week, which is basically like Monday through Saturday, I just straight up delete Instagram and Facebook. And this does a couple things for me. One, I don't waste time on the inane stuff that just has no worth, pretty objectively, right? It has no real relevance. It's just for humor, just for entertainment. And it's fun. I'm a big meme guy. I love my memes, and anyone knows me well knows that I always have something funny to share, but it's not useful when I have so many other things to do. And the secondary effect from that is I'm automatically cutting out a lot of the noise and a lot of the voices. I just don't have access to it. And it's not something that's constantly in my brain. My biggest advice is watch how you're spending your time, right? Like, very objectively, take a step back. And this is what I had to do, especially with Instagram, where I just find myself, I'm tired, I've had a long day. I'm just gonna scroll for a bit, and that usually would turn into an hour or two, or even 3 or 4. And it doesn't do anything for me. In any scheme of things, not even grand scheme of things, any scheme of things, not doing anything for me. But as well, there would be a political side always. There'd be an activist side. There would be an information side. There would be a fact-based side. I would have all these different voices that were constantly filling me up with information coming from a lot of different platforms and a lot of different stories too. Whenever anyone posts anything to a social media website, they're almost hiding. They're creating a post, a finite amount of words, about a bunch of emotions, experiences, and interactions they've had with other people that more than likely have been interacting and come to a head over the course of many years to be represented in this little tiny blog post.
We don't have all of that story that carries back.
You don't have their touchstone, right?
Yes.
And maybe they don't even have their touchstone, so they're writing out of anger, they're writing out of impatience, they're writing out something that isn't even true to them. How are you supposed to take that in just from that and be like, oh, I know exactly what this is talking about? And so what instead I do is I spend my time deliberately in audiobooks and physical books. I have a long list of books that are recommended by peers, by people that I respect, by mentors, and I just keep a list. And I have 3 different platforms for audiobooks, and I'm just constantly filling them in. So in my drive time, I love music as well, and there are often times I will listen to music, but I often fill my drive time with listening to audiobooks. When I go to the gym, when I'm biking to and from school, I'll often fill that time with audiobooks. And listening on 2 times speed, I don't know, not everyone can do that, or wants to do that. I listen to everything on 2 times speed, so I'm able to go pretty quick through some books, and I just will create time throughout the rest of the day to read a physical book as well. And what I have found is, as I've read broadly in so many different categories, from fiction, from fantasy, from nonfiction, historical fiction. I've read a lot of self-help, a lot of psychology books. I find the same stories repeated over and over and over again, the same truth, the same touchstone repeating, partly because I think I'm looking for it, because I already have a fairly well-established touchstone. But then I'm interacting with all this other media and I'm, ooh, I like that. I can take that as my touchstone, or write down some quotes, or write down some thoughts for each one of those. I usually take notes, so I have some sort of record. Ooh, I like that. I like this. By the time I get to the end of my week, I filled myself with a bunch of smaller touchstones. I'm kind of armored up. It sounds kind of dramatic, but it's true. So when I go and re-enter into social media and I'm reading all the updates from people, and I'm reading the latest things that people are angry about or frustrated with, or even the happy things, right? I'm able to interact with them from a much more centered place, at least on my side.
A little more neutral.
A little more neutral. It's all I can control anyway. At very least, how I interact with the rest of the world. And frankly, it's the same answer as how to find a touchstone. It requires a lot of work and it requires a lot of discipline. There's nothing that's easy about this. I don't claim to be perfect with it in the slightest. I still waste lots of time on Instagram. I still love my memes. I still have all this sort of stuff that I know objectively, as I'm seeing, like, none of this matters. But I'm laughing really hard at it. But so this is not claiming to perfection. This is an invitation into a journey that I'm finding very productive and very
It's its own hero's journey in and of itself.
Right. But what I am finding is I'm learning how to be more and more true to myself. That I am consistently working back towards Ithaca. I'm consistently working back towards my Penelope. I want to be centered, because centered is where I feel the best. It's very selfish in a lot of ways. I feel the best when I'm centered, because when I'm giving all these opinions and not really believing in any of it, I feel fake. I feel like I'm not really interacting with the world truthfully. I don't feel like I'm able to be seen truthfully either. And if there's anything that is consistent across these sources, that we want to be seen, we want to be understood, the only way that can happen is if we understand ourselves and are willing to engage with other people wanting to understand them. It can't come without a touchstone. It can't come without something centered within yourself. And frankly, it cannot come if the primary mode of media ingestion is through opinions, through opinion pieces. There has to be some sort of objectivity that you find you can cling to that can then help you sift through the nuance. So my advice is very practical, is how bad do you want it? How bad do you want that feeling? Because it's great. It's a great feeling. The times where I am able to touch my touchstone and be aligned with that, it feels amazing. It requires so much work and discipline, and it's something I'm continually working on. But I do find it very worthwhile and very meaningful. And so anyone who wants that, just do it. Talk to people who are passionate about it, get hyped about it with them, but just do it. There's no other alternative, and there's no shortcut. We learned that from the hero's journey more than anything else. There's no shortcut to something meaningful.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to end with one last thing that I think defines how this does work for you. That often when you meet someone, you ask, what's your favorite book? And when you want to understand someone, I have watched you read that book. So thank you for your example that you've given me. You have helped me learn and value this process more. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experiences and thoughts on this.
It was a pleasure to be here. I love talking about this. So it was a pleasure. I appreciate your questions. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, John.